Committee virtual event. My name's Sophia Liang. I'm currently the Teaching and Learning Program Manager at the MIT Libraries, and I'm your moderator for today's event. We're excited to have you join us for Describing Realities, Imagining Directions, Critical Race Pedagogies in Teaching and Learning. Our speakers today are both amazing teachers whom I learn from every time we talk. I've collaborated with both of these folks before, so I know you're in for an awesome presentation. So first I'm going to do some bios and then I'll let them get into it. Jen Brown is the Design and Technologies Librarian at Barnard College. In her current role, she oversees day-to-day operations of the library's new design center and teaches learner-focused workshops around DIY projects that draw on makerspace technologies for college students. You should also check out the Instagram for the design center, which is design at Barnard, the @sign, where she talks about all of her workshops and what they're doing there. Jorge Lopez McKnight is a library worker at the Austin Community College Riverside campus in Austin, Texas. In his current and past library positions, he participates in various teaching and learning activities with a wide range of learners. And Jorge is not on social media, but you can follow his work because he's always publishing and doing the work. Most recently, his book last year with Teresa Neely, In Our Own Voices Redux, which you can check out now probably from your local library. And throughout the presentation, please ask your questions in the chat as they come up, and Amanda and I will help gather them throughout, and they'll answer the questions at the very end, if that sounds good to everybody. Okay, over to Jen and Jorge.
Cool, peace and blessings, folks. I'm Jorge, and we appreciate you all joining us today in the Zoom room for our presentation. Before we get moving, a couple of things. Quick shout out to the homie Sophia for the wonderful introduction, and mighty thanks to the ACRL Instruction Section Teaching Methods Committee for putting us on. As Sophia mentioned, encourage folks out there to chat feature for comments, questions, emojis, whatever, however you want to use it. And yeah, we'll get this going.
Fantastic. All right, y'all. So the way that we're going to be moving through this today, just so you have a sense around how all of this is going to be shaping up, is that we'll launch with just an activity to get you all kind of thinking about your own institutional, personal contexts and how this fits in with your practice. And then Jorge and I are going to talk about just what's inspired our approaches and understandings to this topic. And then we'll dive into what this work looks like in real time, because obviously that's incredibly important for all of our work. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we imagine moving forward and continuing to do this work, because as you'll hear us talk about, this work doesn't just stop. There is no endpoint. And so we're excited to hop into the activity. Oh, actually, you know what? We did a slight redesign yesterday to our slides. So let me just initially start by saying and prefacing our discussion with the fact that we are operating from a very specific place within the entire conversation that we're going to have today. And that place is not starting with the question, does white supremacy construct inequity and power differences throughout academic libraries, but rather, how does it do that? Because this is not a place for us to question that. We know and understand white supremacy defines and touches every single part of our work. And I have to give a huge shout out to my co-presenter, Jorge, for finding this fantastic definition about white supremacy so that we can all get on the same page. This is coming from a scholar named David Stovall. And in a talk, he actually frames white supremacy in this way. He said, white supremacy is not a group of white extremists calling people the N-word or lynching folks. White supremacy is the understood views and values of Western European descended, able-bodied, heterosexual Christian men as normal, right, and good. Everyone else is deserving of gratuitous punishment until they acquiesce to those purported views and values. And if that ain't the best definition of white supremacy that I have heard, I don't know what is. So just to be clear, we are talking about hierarchical and patriarchal systems of power in and outside of the classroom and learning spaces in particular today, and how it punishes scholars of color and drives many of us out of the profession as well. Does that sound good, Jorge? Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I'll just add a very small, a couple of words just on the end that, and I think Jen will talk a little bit about this later on, about sort of small but very significant shifts. And so in the question, it's a small shift, but it's foundational to our understanding and our approaches for teaching and learning. And it pushes our instruction in a particular deeper race direction to challenge and resist the white supremacy, because we refuse to further marginalize, criminalize, disenfranchise our learners and communities of color, bottom line. And the question is, to give a quick shout out to another scholar activist, Ricky Allen, it's a modification of a question that they put forward around schooling. So we want to stay in this question space a little bit, and to get us all more thinking about race in our teaching and learning, we have some questions for you all to engage. And it's fairly quick, about a minute or two. And you can do this effort a number of ways depending on what you're comfortable with. You can share in the chat. You can respond privately, just with yourself in your cubicle or room or wherever, what have you. Or if you're viewing this with a group of folks, perhaps discuss amongst yourselves. And so the first ones we have up are, when you think about or discuss race, what feelings arise? And then connected to that is identifying one person you are yourself discussing race with. Why is that? So what qualities in that relationship are there that allow you to be yourself in that exchange on race?
So while folks are doing that, Jorge, I think there was a little question about your sound from the mic.
Yeah, is it not, do I need to speak up more?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Oh, it says someone else said it's not the speaker volume, it's so that you're dropping in and out.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to speak louder, or hopefully, I mean, I don't know if my interconnection's funky or what.
Okay, thanks. And someone had the question that they don't understand the second question.
Yeah, that's good to clarify a little bit more. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that when I think of discussing race with I think of discussing race with people, I think of what qualities in a relationship that allow me to discuss it openly, honestly, and that means feeling like valued or appreciated or understood. And so I'm trying to get at what those qualities are in that relationship that allow folks to be themselves and be honest in their discussions about race.
Let's take another 30 seconds or so, if that sounds good to folks. We'll check in again before moving on from this, but just wanted to give you a quick time check. Okay, I know folks are still popping answers into the chat, and please do continue to do so. I'm just going to quickly switch over to the next question so we can stay on track for time. And you can feel free to continue responding to this one if you like, though. The two questions are definitely related. Our next question is really transitioning now to thinking about yourself in your various teaching and learning environments and kind of expanding conversations around how do you feel, how has white supremacy impacted your teaching and learning environments? And I want to be clear here that when we say environments, we mean that word broadly. So everybody is coming from different contexts. Some folks might be doing one-on-one consultation instruction. Some folks might be doing community events or working with different communities of learners. So please take environments as widely as possible. It could be a classroom, could be your office, could be, like a mobile, like a mobile book station, wherever you're coming from. And then how do you feel white supremacy has impacted your learners in those environments? Take another 30 seconds or so to kind of wrap up your thoughts or just add more to the chat. And of course, you can continue adding throughout this discussion. It'll be great to have this work archived so other folks can, see where folks were coming from and what was raised. All right. I think we've both been keeping the things y'all have dropped into the chat. So thank you for your vulnerability and being able to share your context and where you're coming from. I think there's also a lot being touched on in the comments here, everything from sort of how folks are teaching, also to how folks are researching and noticing scholarly publishing practices, metadata. Obviously, critical pedagogies and critical race theory and work like this touches on more than just instruction. So I really appreciate folks who are broadening that context as well. But we're gonna talk a little bit about how we've been inspired in the work that we've done and the work you'll hear about in a bit.
Yeah, and just echoing Jen's point, thank you all for sort of engaging in this work. And we're really excited to share some areas that inspire and drive our teaching and learning. So I got four little boxes up there that have some stuff that's been really highly inspirational to me. And I'll briefly go through some of them. So for me, critical race theory has been hugely influential to my thinking around race, racism, and power, and which is what it looks to investigate in society. It originated in the legal field. Just to give you some background, it's composed of many different elements. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to go in on all of them, but a few worth mentioning are: it puts forward racism as structural and regular, that it's locked into the architecture foundation of society, centers the knowledge of people and communities of color. It's focused on racial justice and ending all oppression. So there's an activist and collective movement to it. It's been described as idealistic and pragmatic, which are good things and strong qualities that pulls me to it. And I think it's especially applicable because it's interrogating the role of white supremacy in society. So by default, then, social institutions like libraries and education and our associated policies, practices, and what have you are complicit in maintaining that system of oppression. Moving next to critical race pedagogies, that comes from education scholars thinking about what CRT looks like in teaching strategies and theories in higher education specifically. So they transported some core ideas from CRT and put forward sort of five themes that are up there. And similar to CRT, focusing on race and how it engages with other social forces, AKA intersectionality. So gender, sexuality, class, able-bodiedness, etc. Challenges dominant ideologies, objectivity that we're in this post-racial moment, equal opportunity, again, has that social justice focus. And it includes knowledges from multiple disciplinary areas and multiple communities of color. Community responsive pedagogy. This teaching and learning work is grounded in understanding that culture and its elements, and I put some up there on the slide or in the box, are hyper unique to that particular location. So then one develops curriculum pedagogies assessments that take all that into account and shape it specifically around the community's needs. And then the last one is culturally sustaining pedagogy, and coming again from ed scholars and building on the work of Gloria Lenton, building culturally relevant pedagogy. Folks engaged in this type of work put forward pedagogies that are, and this is a quote from H. Sami Alim and Django Paris, that are centered on contending in complex ways with the rich and innovative linguistic, literate, and cultural practices of indigenous, Black, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and other youth and communities of color. This work is really powerful, and it's an intentional disruption to the white middle class norms of educational achievement that are held as a standard, and instead moves the focus up to that system/structure, i.e. white supremacy. And real quickly, and there's some library folks out there doing this work, probably others I don't know of, but the two people that come to mind are Khalid Warren, who incorporates this work specifically. And I haven't had an opportunity to attend the presentations. And I think some of the work that Allison Hicks gets at some of these ideas and approaches.
Dope. And yeah, I just gotta add that literally Jorge's his work in this area has informed a lot of how I've approached my work too. So just saying, y'all are so lucky to be learning from him today. And for me, I have a mix of inspirations that have really driven me, both as far as it relates to kind of theory or theoretical frameworks from scholars, but also just things that, while I'm not necessarily going to attribute them to a specific scholar, are just, and they've been written about very widely, are things that have really just colored the way I understand my relationship to learning spaces, how I navigate my identity, my race, my gender, my sexuality in the academy and throughout the academy. So my first one, and if y'all have ever gone to a talk where I have been on it or on a panel, you will have heard this one, and I love it, so I'm saying it again. Emergent Strategy, which is a kind of a radical justice-oriented book that gets at ways of working within systems, acknowledging sort of like your individual impact within a system, and thinking about creating restorative justice minded organizations, communities, and projects. So, but I find that it's both amazing because it allows me to explore different theories that are pivotal to how I understand learning. So there's this concept that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about called fractal theory, which is this idea that the things that we do echo out, the small sort of like ripples in a pond, the small drops that we make do echo and touch other folks. So that is why doing the reflective and reflexive work of looking at ourselves and the ways in which we perpetuate systems of oppression against especially folks of color is important. And then she talks a lot about being able to understand that systems and cycles are iterative and not being afraid of failure, which is such an important thing in teaching and learning. I saw someone put in the chat actually earlier that they're afraid to talk about race or afraid to talk about things because they don't want to microaggress someone or do something wrong. But I think that's the point of doing this work. If you don't do it, you won't grow. You have to be in uncomfortable spaces to grow and understand that we are always growing and changing, and that our growth and progression is an iterative experience. But at the core of her work, she mentions that, you know, you can't do any of this work without rooting your own ethos in some kind of restorative justice, which understands that if you are in a majority place in society, that you are part of white supremacy as a machine, even if you think you're not trying to be. And that's the first step to being able to understand that there are communities, minoritized communities who need to be given that restorative justice. And what role do you have to play in that? And what role do you have to amplify the voices of folks doing the work? Because we are out here doing the work. The other piece that really inspires me is speculative futuring. And as a writer, this is particularly important to me. This comes out of two main inspirations that affected me. One was a workshop called Speculative Future of Libraries and Archives that our very moderator here, Sophia, ran out of MIT with some colleagues. And it was about sort of imagining what the future of libraries look like without some of the oppressions and isms, and imagining what technologies and services might look like too. But there's another work that comes out of Adrienne Marie Brown, again, and Walida Imarisha, who wrote a book called Octavia's Brood. And both of them assert that whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons or capitalism, we are engaging in an exercise of speculative fiction. And so they've actually held these speculative writing workshops in Detroit where they bring together community activists to write the future. So there's something really powerful about putting marginalized folks in spaces and places where we can write ourselves into worlds that have been denied to us, worlds that we have been forcibly kept out of, and thinking about ways of creation and ways of being. My third section here is on reconfiguring learning spaces. This is not something, this is something that's been talked about by lots of folks, but for me, I'm coming from a place where when I think about race-conscious teaching and learning, we have to examine where that teaching is taking place. And a lot of it is taking place in learning spaces that have been designed and shaped by white supremacy. These spaces presume able-bodiedness across the visible and invisible disability spectrums. They presume that instructors, where the instructors at the front of the room are the only creators of knowledge. They presume that there's only one way to create and consume knowledge, as if like whiteboards and slides are like the only way to learn. They stratify learners, which is in part because the academy is incredibly white. But it means that when someone like me walks into a classroom, I do feel like I am an only. It makes particularly learners feel hyper-visible, and think about, again, being an only in a space and sitting in this sea of white folks and how that feels. And to teach in a race-conscious way for me is to acknowledge that I have to actively change up the spaces I'm in, shift them around either by moving chairs or really just by teaching somewhere else entirely to deconstruct what are sort of inherent power imbalances. And then anti-oppressive facilitation. Again, this is one that there's a lot of research and writing on, but for me, this is about going beyond good intentions. So it's the idea that we have to hold ourselves as facilitators when we write a little community agreement on the wall at the beginning of the session, or we have a syllabus that says, like, you know, we're going to be talking about this, this, and this, that when white supremacy or racism and all these things happen in real time in the classroom or in the learning space, you have to call folks out and in. Otherwise, those intentions just remain good-looking intentions and words that haven't been followed through on. And this is something I'm personally trying to grow within. But these are kind of things that have really shaped my praxis in this area. And before we kind of move on, Jorge, was there anything else you wanted to mention from your section? Or are you ready to, we can pop into talking about action too, if you're ready.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm ready to move on. Can folks hear me okay? I'm not sure, the connection's still being funky. Okay, I'm gonna keep it going. So thank you, Jen, for that. So yeah, let's transition to discussing what efforts have looked like on the ground for us, so that you all know we're just not only up here talking shit, but we actually do the work. And I also want to keep in mind that even though we've actualized some of these ideas and strategies, we're still very much reaching and evolving towards them. So we'll move into, I think, Jen, we have you up next.
Yes. And so much yes to what Jorge said. This is work that is ongoing. There is no end point. So just to give y'all some context for where I'm coming from, a lot of my examples and a lot of the work I'll talk about is coming from my previous job, where I did a lot of information literacy instruction. I found this as a particularly powerful site to do this work because of the limitations that are often placed around IL instruction, such as having to do one-shots or not really being able to kind of approach the critical teaching methods that we would like to, because it's not actually our class, you know, for a long term. So I'll start by talking about some of the critical acts I've put into practice that are both small and a little larger. The first one that is baseline, just baseline, is acknowledging my positionality, my owning my Blackness and my queerness, and all of the other identities that make me up as a person. This is, I mean, you start there, but it also means that I'm trying to focus on planning with race and identity in mind with lessons. And even in contexts where I'm teaching or orienting learners to something new, and you wouldn't think that you can talk about race in that environment, I'm going to, because I am Black all the time. I don't get to not be Black, and I would never not want to be that way. And so for me, what that looks like is a lot of as part of the information literacy work I used to do, I used to have to orient some students to using a technology in my old library, just a VR headset, because they were writing papers on virtual reality and augmented reality. So they wanted to experience it in person to get some hands-on engagement. And I made a regular point to not only talk about sort of the device and how great it was, but I also talked about, and I drew their attention to the fact that I genuinely and generally cannot put this headset on my head because it was not designed for people with hair like mine. Most of the time when I would go to work, I could not wear this tool. And many of them were not Black, and they were surprised that they hadn't thought of that. And it was a really fruitful way to have a small discussion about identity, even in a context where they weren't expecting that to be something that they would be talking about. And talking about the way designers don't think about other folks, and talking about the way those sorts of headsets are not thinking about folks with vision impairments. You cannot put glasses in many of those headsets either. So again, acknowledging positionality for me is about walking the walk as much as it is framing it initially. And then the second thing for me is being able to thoughtfully frame information literacy workshop research topics around BIPOC examples. And for folks who don't know, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And when I say thoughtfully, I italicize thoughtfully here because I don't just mean that, start your information literacy session by researching Black Lives Matter in your library catalog. I'm talking about intentionally creating lesson plans with a through line that progresses over the course of the session so that learners are not feeling like this is a one-off thing that was just thrown in for the sake of being thrown in. So for me, I actually did a lot of information literacy instruction with classes where I would start with something big like the Black Lives Matter movement and search in the catalog and either use the opportunity to talk about how, look at the things that we don't have in our catalog about this. But then I would transition and frame it as a real research topic because A, I'm interested in this, but B, because it deserves that attention. I would move into databases and talk and extend Black Lives Matter to talk about how Black trans women were being murdered and those murders were going unaddressed. Both because I want to show what's happening to sisters in my community, but also because it's something that students may not necessarily be connecting. And certainly given their topics, it really did vary. But I was able to frame research topics in a way that made it clear that it was like I was researching it. I wasn't just sort of saying things. For me, the other thing that also made a huge difference was teaching outside of what the academy sort of deems critical, useful, scholarly, all of those things. So I highly encourage teaching with open web resources and multimedia and things like web archives to frame conversations around race and identity. At least it worked really well for me. There were many sessions where I used that as an ability to talk about the search engines where students were going to be starting with, which was Google, to critique those search engines in the same way that scholars like Dr. Sophia Noble has already done in talking about bias and algorithmic searching, and to show how when you search for things, you do get, conservative leaning websites and such, but to also show what it looks like when you can find resources that are cultivated by the community, resources like this police violence in Cleveland web archive, where this is coming from folks who are directly impacted by this and who get to frame their own narrative. Because quite frankly, if I have to wait for the academy or my institution to create a web resource around this, I might be waiting for quite a while. And it allows me to value everything from blog posts to literature, to science fiction and fantasy literature, and to showcase tools and resources that students and learners are going to be able to access when they leave my institution. Everything is still behind a paywall. And everything outside of these sort of curated academic channels is devalued. And I just want to shout out real quick to my folks, Sophia and Jorge. We actually did comics, hip hop, and information literacy critical pedagogies for student empowerment session at a conference last year where we got to incorporate hip hop and comic book literature and content to have this very discussion, but with educators. So for me, it's been fruitful, both with all sorts of learners and learner types. And then the last thing for me that makes the biggest difference is if there is not a way for me to fit this work into the mold that has been left behind by a faculty member or into a 50-minute information literacy session, because you don't have a lot of time, I will make my own. I will make my own stuff, which is what I did with a colleague last year. We created a series called Reading Bias, which was an hour-and-a-half session where we introduced folks to the topics of interest. So last year we did machine learning, intersectionality, and social media, bots in social media. We had a short little reading or a video that we had at the beginning to get everyone up to speed because we wanted to let everyone participate and not feel like, well, if I don't know anything about this topic, I can't be in the room. And then we created an atmosphere where folks could devise a community-created syllabus where they could bring up anything and all information resources were valued so that they felt helped them learn about or understand this topic. We started with the community norms so that everyone understood what was expected and how we were all going to be respectfully treating each other in this space. But we had everything from magazine articles to comic books to movies and film to music. Literally everything that you can think of was linked, and you'll be able to see the syllabi in a later slide. I have a little link to them if you want to. But I found that being able to create the space to center race conscious analyses outside of the traditional class times was just it changed my practice dramatically. So
cool, thank you, Jen. So yeah, I think for me, when I think about my practice and how I've tried to actualize some of this work we've been discussing, a couple of specific efforts come to mind. And first, let me provide some context for these. So this work took place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I was a first-year librarian at the University of New Mexico, a large public four-year research institution where communities of color are the majority student population. And so in this activity, what we have up on the screen is we took place with first-year students that had a typical research assignment requiring students to locate and examine sources related to their topic. And here I'm really trying to lean on culturally sustaining pedagogy and CRT. And so the students explored various types of information sources focused on hip hop individually and as a group, and then presented their observations and findings to the class. The questions we put forward try to get them thinking and engaging with race and how it shapes their understanding of information and knowledge. And then in the larger conversation, my facilitation really has to push it towards a critical race turn, and that's on me to be prepared to be myself and to kick it up a notch, right? And one of the aims of the session and through this activity and through the material that is culturally sustaining is to arrive in an understanding that disrupts ideas of what's appropriate or what counts, what's valued, legitimized as knowledge, especially as it relates to images, language, text, and especially in academic library collections. And we also get to investigate whose voices and bodies are excluded for certain information processes. Looks like I'm breaking up again. Is that better? Yes, no. So we get to investigate what voices and bodies are excluded from certain information processes, from either being an author or from participating in generating that knowledge, and how this is not just random or coincidence, but structural, historical, and still very much contemporary. And as everybody knows, not everything is all good in hip hop, right? So we problematize racialized gender dynamics and how that can be reflected in knowledge production and representation. In the next activity that I'll just briefly be discussing is focused on working with a high school class and connecting them to the university library. So a colleague and I collaborated with a high school psychology class, 10th and 12th graders from a local high school less than 3 miles from UNM's central campus that has a significant Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian communities. In this activity, we were in one of the less stale rooms in the library, and the learners were grouped together around 3 or 4 folks with a glass board, writing surface and markers. So super low tech, and we're all also in a circle together focused on thinking about and through libraries as social institutions. What are they? What's their purpose? And so we put forward, describe your library experience. So we start on their terms. And to be fully transparent, my colleague and I know their space because we've been in their library with them. And so we asked them to describe their experiences and knowledge around libraries they're familiar with. What do they see represented? How are their racialized identities affirmed, held, or absent? They hear multiple languages. Some of their observations include hearing multiple languages from multiple communities of color, seeing communities of color engaged in various types of activities, seeing Black and brown art on the walls. They notice the librarian and non-student library assistants are not people of color, so not in positions of power, and how that mirrors other arrangements in their worlds. Some students commented on the material that honors their realities, interests, and histories. So from there, we transitioned to explore and this is all taking place at UNM's main library, the physical spaces of the libraries, and extend their experiences and knowledge to critically unpack similarities and differences between the 2 libraries. And we get to discuss some of those funny libraries are now for everyone signs, and pushing on what they think that means. We discuss who historically and currently this particular specific library has been for and why it's come to be like that. What's in this space, who physically, intellectually is allowed in here, whose land are we on? And I think we begin to understand that this library, and by extension, this particular higher education site, is trying to do something very ugly to them. That there's an intentional dispossession of these communities, and that they are pushed in a particular way to participate in the operation of that place. And most often not as students or faculty members or folks in positions of power. It doesn't allow them to be there in certain roles and in certain ways. And though there's students of color in that space, those students aren't from that particular high school or that neighborhood. But it's not all wildness. We get at their presence and engagement that can be acts of defiance. And in my role as facilitator, I need to keep on those racialized elements. And I think overall, we get to observe in real time sort of the full force of white supremacy through academic libraries. And I really lean on heavily CRT lens and a community responsive lens in that activity and in that time together. So I think we're gonna, hopefully the audio is still okay. I think we're gonna transition to thinking about where we're going to move next with our thinking, our dreaming about our work, about our directions.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about this throughout this presentation so far, but just to reiterate, the most important takeaway here is that moving forward is about acknowledging that there's really no stopping point. There's no like point of even real. There's no end point. There's no, I've mastered this topic. I don't have to read anymore. I don't have to engage with the literature. And there's also no such thing as perfection. A lot of engaging and doing this work in your own context will mean finding inspirational resources for your own practice, engaging with the work of other folks in your community who are doing this. I mean, y'all should take note of who's in the room, because maybe there are connections and collaborations that could be made based on folks who care about this topic. And being willing to mess up, being willing to self-critique and to reflect on your work as often as you can, and reflect on it with communities who are going to call you in and keep it real with you, to let you know if there's an area that they see you needing to work on, or just to shout you out and to be like, I see you growing. I mean, it goes sort of both ways. Does that sound right, Jorge? Was there anything you wanted to add to our little kind of collective thought there?
Yeah, no, I think that really touches on the main things. I think I'll really push on that, that this work isn't, it's ongoing, it's always a work in progress, and that it's a collective effort. And it's not some lone savior position that folks are in. You have to be in a community that is doing this work.
Yes, so much emphasis on the collective, and I'll just shout out to my folks and peeps who have helped me grow throughout this, because I wouldn't be doing this work without them, including Jorge. But as for the way I see myself growing and developing in this practice, so y'all will notice that earlier in the talk I mentioned that basically all of my work was from my previous role, and I started at this new position that I'm in 10 months ago. And I think a lot of my hopes going forward are to develop sort of a better understanding and just a better practice of engaging with race-conscious teaching and learning in the makerspace that I oversee. I think there's a fantastic body of literature on critical making and on gender inequity throughout makerspaces. I think we're having those conversations at conferences, we're having those conversations on forums and websites, so that's dope. But I think we are missing some conversations in this area. I think we're missing how to explore the ways in which instructional programs can support not just necessarily sort of talking about like why aren't women using makerspaces, which is a huge globular category, right? Like women can be broken down into many categories, but it also tends to suggest that we have an overabundance of men and does not break down what we mean by men. So I want to know what can be done to support gender nonconforming, non-binary, and trans folk of color in makerspaces. I want to see them making in the spaces that I'm in and in as many makerspaces as possible. And in particular, I want to see how to support men of color as well. Because again, when we're talking about white supremacy, you have to be willing to drill down and concretely name the things that you are talking about, name the folks who are impacted. So I also want to find ways to make it clear that using tools and spaces and teaching and learning, whether it's with a power tool or a laser cutter or 3D printing, you might think that it's not about race and that there is no way to construct lessons around race, but it is. You don't just become a blank slate when you pick up a tool to use it. You retain that identity. So something I'm hoping to do this fall actually is to collaborate with other centers in the Barnard Library where I work on actually leading a speculative futuring workshop here on campus to support folks dreaming about liberatory futures, to support the art that they want to create and bringing those liberatory futures to life. I'm imagining something where we talk about and deconstruct race and identity and just name our positionalities and acknowledge where we're coming from and expose ourselves to tons of resources. And then where folks in the room are given the ability to write the future they want to see or photograph the future they want to see or draw it or make paper origami, whatever expression they want. And then potentially having a making element to that and asking, if you could make a small piece of that come to life, what would it look like? And can you prototype that and bring in some of that iteration and that community aspect? So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to do some of that work later on this year.
Yeah, and I think for me, similarly, like really engaging more in literature, some of the stuff we mentioned here earlier, just taking the time and thinking through this. I think I don't know if Jen, you mentioned this today, but yesterday talked about that this work takes time, and putting in the time and energy and effort to really move in this direction. It requires that. I just recently moved, I guess like a little over a year ago, from Albuquerque to Austin, Texas, which is where I'm at now. From a university library to a community college library. So I'm trying to think through and around teaching and learning in a reference exchange and how to be critical in that exchange. Let's see. I'd love to do some stuff around Cardi B. I'd love to bring Cardi B in the classroom because I think she really brings important critical cultural elements around race and gender, class, and language. I think would be important information sources to unpack. I think exploring the racialized information worlds of learners would be really exciting because I think they're already rich, deep, and complex, and so to get to unpack those practices and connect those and make meaningful processes to their position in community college would be exciting. And just understanding the community that I'm now part of, which is with work Southeast Austin, and what's going on there in terms of the relationship between the community college and community.
All right, fam and folks, we're getting to the end of this. I'm gonna come back to the slide real quick because I just want to make sure everybody knows. Our contact information is available here. If you want to get in touch with us after this, please do. And we have a little resources slide in case you were wondering about some of the things we dropped over the course of this talk. So since this is being recorded, you'll be able to get to these names and links and books and all that good stuff later on. But we are hopping into Q&A territory now, and we just kindly request that you do not ask us how to solve racism in your classrooms or at your institution or on your job. You know, we're not here to do that work. That is your work. But we are looking forward to hearing the other questions that y'all have for us.
I think someone asked your Instagram, Jen.
Was it? I was gonna type in. Were you wondering about the Barnard Design Center Instagram or the Barnard one? I'm gonna actually throw it in the chat for you.
Okay, there are a few questions. I'm going to help out with this. From Emily, thinking about time and the time this work takes, how do you find it for or with each other?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm gonna shout out just some of the virtual spaces and places that folks I love have cultivated. Slack has been actually a great space. I have like a little group space where I chat with folks on the regular, kind of just about critical work, the work that we're doing at work. And I find that that's been an organic way for me to reflect with other folks who are doing it in different contexts to get support and inspiration. I also want to shout out both Jorge and Sophia for the amazing MIT Press book that they are co-editing. That has also, in that area, they have made space for many of the co-authors to come together and do this work, both for our book chapters, but also just for general support as we're navigating like the daily practice. And so just, yeah, virtual spaces have made a huge, big difference for me.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that. I think really being intentional and centering that work in your sort of day-to-day has to be, you have to put that up front. And it might mean cutting out other things that don't align with that. And that's something folks have to decide for themselves. And I think to Jen's point, it really is a community, a collective effort. I was really privileged and fortunate, blessed to connect with a high school teacher in Albuquerque, Robert Frosto, who is a long-term educator. And so I learned a lot about this type of work from my interactions and that connection with that person. So really the sort of sense of community of struggling together in this.
Great. Second question from Francis. Can you speak more to how you've changed physical classroom spaces to disrupt power dynamics?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Some contexts are easier than others. I've taught in a lot of rooms that have like fixed pairs or just like almost like a lecture, not quite lecture style, but just like the desks are rooted to the floor. You can move the chairs around, but that's about it. So in those instances, it's usually been just a small thing. I try not to hover around the podium, and I try to join in groups and just create lots of opportunities for people to talk with and across and to each other. And I try to be an observer a lot of the time in those spaces, just because it feels so fixed already that I guess I feel like having a more fluid space and activity where students can kind of define where they want to go from there has been helpful. And that looks literally like we might do a pair chair for what was supposed to be 10 minutes, but then it kind of evolves into conversations about just research practices in general, or just even sometimes it's like sidebars, like things that people were excited to watch over the weekend. I don't know if that feels like a disruption in the learning space, but because there's this idea that like we are in a classroom and we must be talking about research all the time, it feels like making room for for conversations that still touch research, but maybe like not as like neatly as they're supposedly supposed to, are really helpful. And then I taught those reading bias workshops outside the library. I went to other spaces and places that were just better, slightly better designed, round tables where everybody was just facing each other. There weren't a bunch of discrete desks, things like that.
Yeah, and I'll add just to that. I mean, that's such a structural question. It's a good question, which to me, it happens at the structural level. So there, I feel like a couple things have to be happening. One, the day-to-day practice is how we're also modifying that. So moving desks out of the way, having more space, opening the blinds, getting more light in. That those have to take place, and also there needs to be a larger interrogation of those learning spaces to shift foundationally. And I think that support has to come from folks in your library, people, maybe your boss's boss, and folks like that. So, we're really going to stress this sort of community effort to move in that direction, to change that structurally, if that makes sense.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. From Stephanie, this is a question for Jen. Can you please share what you have done in the makerspace to engage CRT?
Yeah, just real quick. Though I haven't done as much as I would have liked to just in my teaching practices and the workshops I've led, because this was the first year of our existence, I put a lot of energy and effort into the documentation that really surrounds just both our public-facing website, our mission statement. I tried to connect a lot of the work we're doing to principles of design justice, which I think came out of the Allied Media Conference network a few years back, which talks about just like community and participatory design that focuses on the communities that you're working with. It's intended for I think architecture folks who are going into communities and designing things, but I think it's also great just for thinking about how we approach creation with the users walking into our space. I've also tried to put a lot of thought into the ways that staff, my student staff, and my other professional staff are supported, how we relate to each other, creating just methodologies and ways for us to share what's going on, protecting them as much as possible from microaggression or calling out instances of racism, which I've had to do already. And so it's like I've been incorporating a little bit of CRT, which just generally presumes that white supremacy exists, and not thinking that the makerspace is beyond that, because we don't talk about race, there's just tools in here. So just trying to come from a place of intentionality with our first year docs and with our staffing development.
Okay, well, since we're almost at 2 o'clock, and I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, thank you to our speakers, Jen and Jorge, for a really educational presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Special thanks to Eloise Sharp for helping us run this webinar. And then the committee is going to be sending out a feedback survey to all attendees by email. So please help us out by taking the survey. Thank you.